This meeting.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the AIAA Los Angeles section town hall meeting today. This is actually the first um, presentation event of the year because our year start from June to May. So this is actually the first one and the biggest one. And we have a very distinguished speaker and very exciting topic. And you can see that the wonderful display is the largest, the biggest display ever for the F-15 from the speaker. So before that, I would like to thank everybody, welcome everybody for coming here, and on behalf of the AIAA Los Angeles section, welcome you. If you are a member, welcome. You remember to renew. If you are not, please think about joining us. A great benefit. Um, First of all, the restroom is right outside of the door. You need to wave hands to the librarian so they can unlock the door for you. So that's very important. Secondly, and there's there are donuts, wonderful donuts, Krispy Kreme in the kitchen, and also bottled water. Please enjoy. And so, yeah, welcome. You have a seat. So that's pretty much I want to say. So if you have any question about the other way, Los Angeles section, please let me know. Then just some of the upcoming events. So next Saturday, we are going to have a planetary defense and asteroid exploration mini conference. Also on Saturday, June 28th in the Culver City Library. After that, on July 14, in the Common Space Brewery, we have interesting talk by a lady pilot and talking about how she pilot airplane just by the foot using the toes because she lost her arms, and then also the team building the special aircraft. It's very inspirational and motivational. And after that, and AIAA has a SAN and Aviation Forum conference in Las Vegas uh, from July 21st to July 25th in Las Vegas, Caesar Forum. It's the largest aviation and space conference in the area. And this is the last year it's going to be in this on the West Coast. Next year it's going to be in DC for ASCEND and possibly aviation probably go to another city. So this is last time it's a co-localization of those two events. And afterwards, on August 23rd, we are working on an event for very exciting, people do a lot of communication, satellite, antenna, radar system. The company going to talk about the components, for the challenges. So so I'm going to come back to our distinguished speaker because today's topic, actually, you can see actually this is her new talk. She actually created a talk very recently. It's about her passion for the X-15. So because of this, she's actually going to talk a lot about her career and the story uh, for her writing of this bestseller book. So I'm not going to repeat all the bio, but one thing I want to let you know is that Michelle is really, really passionate about X-15. So she dedicated everything her life into actually doing lectures, speaking, and you can see amazing collections. I was talking to her. I was proposing to Ella, but hopefully we can have a permanent room, so she doesn't have to move the display here and take it down and then take back. It's doing multiple. We should have a permanent room with a display, and she can just come give a lecture. Hopefully that will happen.
Living room.
That's right. That's going to be a living room. Exactly. So this is part of your family. Elevate is your home, is your family, for the speaker, for Sherry, for Brian, for Khaled, everybody. This is your room. This is your home. So we welcome everybody. So again, Michelle is our Elevate distinguished lecturer. In case you didn't realize, she's our distinguished lecturer for many years, and also that she's the author of the bestseller book as you can see the display here. And of course, she is a very good writer, journalist, photographer. So without further ado, let's welcome our distinguished speaker today, Ms. Michelle Evans.
Well, thank you for everybody to be here today. It's my pleasure to be here and give you this story. Um, I hope you enjoy the display. It's, as I say, it's the biggest one I put together so far because it incorporates a lot of the stuff that I regularly bring in, but also I have a special display, which is the one on the far left, which has to do specifically with this lecture. So that's, yeah, it's just been a really great time to do this. And I want to thank Ken for having me and the AIAA. It's really great to be here. I've done a lot of talks for them. And as you will find as I go through the presentation today, I'm very OCD. This is my number 170th talk on the X15. So, and my goal is to make it to 199 if I can get that far, because that's the same number of flights as the X15 had. So yeah. Anyway, so with that, I'm Michelle Evans, and I want to thank you for being here today. I wrote the book about the highest and fastest research aircraft to ever take to the skies. It is entitled The X-15 Rocket Plane, Flying the First Wings into Space. Normally, I'd be speaking about the content of the book, the X-15 itself, and the people who made it all happen. However, today I will instead be taking you on a personal journey about why the book was written, how it all happened to bring this book into existence. This is my adventures with the X-15 rocket plane. My journey started when I was in kindergarten, and I first became fascinated with the idea of writing a book. I was amazed every time that my teacher would transport us across time and space by simply reading. In those days, we were not taught to read until first grade, so I would look at the book she had and wonder at how those tiny words inside could do such miraculous things. I wanted to be able to do that myself. At the same time, my father worked for a company called Sangamo Electric, setting up expensive multi-track data tape recorders at government locales such as the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake and the Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert. His instruments acquired telemetry from military tests of aircraft, missiles, and other weapon systems. Most of what he did he could not share with me. One morning before going to school, my father asked if I would like to tag along on one of his trips to Edwards. I jumped at the chance, although for a 5-year-old kid, it was a scary proposition to head into the desert with aircraft of every sort under the sun thundering through the clear, bright sky. I waited at the curb outside my classroom at the appointed time for my father to pick me up to begin my first adventure, and that is one that eventually changed my life. The trepidation of that first trip quickly turned to awe as I saw the wonders in store. It was the first of many such excursions over the next several years. This was the dawn of the era of spaceflight, when we could go everywhere and do everything. The moon was within our grasp. The rockets being launched at Cape Canaveral were wonderful and exciting, but I saw those only on television. Whereas on these trips to the other NASA up at Edwards, I could see the real vehicles up close. I also had a young child's delight in getting to meet the people who flew the test flights and lots of others on the ground who truly made it all happen. Since my father also had work to do, he often found a friend who would walk me around to behind-the-scenes tours. We'd wander through the hangars or out on the flight line to see what was on the ramp being prepared for a future flight, or what may have just come back from a sortie. I vividly recall watching with fascination as the X-15 was slung under the wing of a B-52 mothership and made ready for flight. There was so much going on, the jumble of equipment, personnel going about their jobs, everyone often doing things where I had no idea of their purpose. It was paradise for a curious kid with lots of questions and a yearning for excitement. On one such trip, my father's friend decided to take me to see the X-15 simulator, also known as the Iron Bird. He knew it was in use and thought I might like to see it in operation. It was a long contraption with pipes and wires and sheet metal looking like something a child such as myself might cobble together out of an erector set. We stood and watched for a bit, then the pilot finished his mission and exited the cockpit. And instead of walking away to some debriefing or back to his office, he saw me and decided to come over and say hello. I have no idea who my guide was that day, but I will always remember that moment when he introduced me to the X-15 research pilot who had just exited the simulator. His name was Neil Armstrong. We also returned to Edwards for the annual Edwards Air Show, and I always loved checking out these exciting aircraft. And yes, that's tiny little me in the corner there on the left side. Long time ago. Now in school, I kept the dream alive about someday writing my book, but had no idea that eventually my passion for writing would intersect with my fascination with the X-15. I spent several years taking journalism classes in junior high and high school, and when it came time to face the reality of college, I knew that I had no money to pursue that goal. Because of that, my life took a major turn as I decided to join the U.S. Air Force. I figured I would learn some great skills and also be able to pay for my college as I served. My father was an aerospace engineer, and I never figured I would follow in his footsteps. I saw that as being a long ways from my goal to becoming a writer. Yet there I was working on nuclear missile systems for 8 years in the Air Force. At one point, I felt I would make the military my career, but for various reasons, after I finished my degree, I finally decided to go out on my own and return home to California. At that point, I went into vibration, shock, and acoustic testing for the aerospace industry for the next dozen years. And yes, that's a picture of me sitting on a nuclear weapon, but we won't talk about that. However, less than 3 years out of the military, with my career going well, the idea of pursuing my original goal as a writer started to gnaw at me again. The final push came suddenly on the 21st of September in 1983, when I was reading the preface to a book on experimental aircraft. In it, the author talked about how his book was just an overview of a multitude of programs, and that many of the aircraft he wrote of deserved full books of their own. And this book is one of the things on the table in the back that you can check out. It was like lightning had struck as everything finally fell into place. As a kid, I'd been fascinated with the X-15 research aircraft because of those trips to Edwards with my dad. All that came flooding back to me as I read that author's statement, and it dawned on me that I had the perfect subject for my book, the X-15 rocket plane. The next morning, I called the Edwards History Office and spoke with Dr. Richard Hallian. I told him I wanted to write a book on the X-15, and I asked if I could come up to start my research using their files. He said, "Come on up." On September 22nd, my wife Cherie and I headed north into the Mojave Desert and met with Dr. Hallian. I spent hours going through the files and photographs and spoke with him about my intended project. He mentioned that X-15 pilot Milt Thompson was currently the chief engineer at NASA Dryden and asked if I'd like to go over and do an interview. I was absolutely not prepared for such an interview, but there was also no way that I would turn that down. So of course I said yes. He called Milt, who agreed to the interview, and we headed over to the NASA facility a mile or so from the history office. We sat with Milt and had a wonderful interview. At one point, Milt called in one of his best friends, Jack Kolf, from the office next door. Jack was a flight planner on the X-15 project, and between the two of them, Cherie and I had an enlightening and fun afternoon talking about the X-15. From that first interview, things expanded quickly as I connected with the other pilots who were still alive, as well as others associated with the program. There were 12 pilots who flew the X-15, and 9 of them were still with us at that time. Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Mike Adams were gone, but I had hopes of connecting with members of their families in order to tell their stories as well. The 9 X-15 pilots I was able to interview, besides Milt, were Scott Crossfield, Robert White, Forrest Peterson, Robert Rushworth, Neil Armstrong, Joe Engle, Pete Knight, and Bill Dana. Each was a unique experience. As an example, I contacted Neil Armstrong for an interview. After a couple of months of planning, I drove into a tiny Ohio town on a rainy Thursday afternoon in early May, looking for his office. I knocked on the door, and for a long time, no one answered. Had he forgotten our appointment? Finally, the door creaked open, and a very old man was standing there. I thought, is this Neil's dad or something? When I said I was there to see Neil, he had to think for a long moment. He scratched his head, and then he said, "Oh, you must be looking for that astronaut feller." I told him yes, I was, and he explained that the address number I had was incorrect by one digit, and he directed me to the right location down the street. Soon after, I was knocking at the correct door, and his secretary answered, inviting me in out of the rain. My first glimpse of Neil in his office that wet afternoon, the first time I had seen him in person since that day with the X-15 simulator, was him standing there with a wastebasket in hand, trying to place it to catch the rain coming through leaks in his roof. It was raining harder inside than outside, and the can was just one of several that were scattered about the room. Neil set the can on the floor under the drip. Looking around the room at the mess, he suggested we find a new spot for the interview, so we walked across the street to a neighborhood ice cream parlor. We found a corner table near the front window and sat down to talk. I recall that meeting fondly and can now listen to that tape of his mild but assured voice answering my queries. In the background are various sounds of the parlor, chairs scratching on the tile floor, the cash register ringing up, the tinkling of the tiny bell as the doors opened and closed. This is just one of my many vivid memories from all the interviews conducted for this book, part of my personal journey with regard to the X-15. Earlier on that same research trip to speak with Neil, I had an appointment in the suburbs of Virginia to see the only Navy pilot in the program, Forrest Peterson. Early Saturday morning, I was looking for his street when I recognized the entrance to the Central Intelligence Agency off to my left. Just a few blocks later, I turned into a small cul-de-sac where Admiral Peterson lived. When he invited me in, I immediately knew that it was going to be a very informal interview, as he had apparently just awakened and was wearing a light blue robe covered in cat hair. We conducted the interview at his kitchen table as his wife puttered around making coffee and breakfast. Each interview was special. Joe Engel in a dimly lit sitting room with a porthole at the Queen Mary cruise ship in Long Beach, Scott Crossfield on a bench in the echoing hallways of the Rayburn Center office building in Washington, D.C., Jack Koff and Milt Thompson at their desks at Dryden on Christmas Day with brownies that Cherie and I brought to share as we conducted another interview. And no, they're not that kind of brownies. Robert Rushworth with his doormat reading Aliens Welcome when we went to see him on my birthday. Pete Knight fielding phone calls as he was deciding whether to run for political office for the first time. 17 technicians and engineers from the program in the back room of a restaurant speaking together of their X-15 exploits to keep each other honest, as they quipped. John McTeague proudly displaying a leftover rear X-15 landing skid in his living room. Jim Robertson talking of working on the external tanks, then pulling out numerous display cases of creepy and exotic bugs that he had collected from trips all across the world. Jim Townsend becoming animated with X-15 stories just weeks before he passed away. Grace Walker and Frida Adams at opposite ends of the country, but both with mist in their eyes as they talked of their X-15 pilots' husbands who are now long gone. In May of 2004, a breakthrough occurred in my research. An Eagle Scout candidate, John Badelsky, was tasked with creating a memorial to honor the only X-15 pilot lost in the line of duty, Michael Adams. I was invited to the unveiling out in the desert near Ridgecrest where the crash occurred in November of 1967. At that event, there were many people associated with the aircraft who were present. Over the years, it had been fairly easy to connect with those on the front line of the program, such as the pilot, the managers, the flight planners. But on that day, I was finally able to connect with those who worked in the trenches, the mechanics, technicians, and guys in the rocket shop. And I also met other members of Mike's family, which was critical to tell his story. That opened up a whole new avenue for me and gave me what I had been looking for to properly flesh out the story I wanted to tell. In the end, I interviewed more than 70 people and created over 1,200 pages of transcripts from those interviews. I also had a couple of thousand photographs that needed to be sorted, scanned, and color corrected. Our beautiful cat Fluffy was always there to help in that process, as you can see. I couldn't believe he walked right out into the middle of the photos. It's like perfect timing, Fluffy. You know. Now, another aspect of my being able to tell the story properly was to get the feel of the actual places where all this happened. This territory was known as the X-15 High Range. So besides my travels all across the country to research and interview important people, I made several trips to these locations, from Edwards Air Force Base to the dry lake beds where emergency landings occurred. To get these places to get to these places took a lot of research, as no maps existed to show the way. Sometimes it took multiple trips in order to find the right location and how to get there. An example is, here's the Beatty High Range radar station in southern Nevada as it appeared during the X-15 program. There was an easily traversable road in those days to get up the hill from the main highway. When I went searching, that road had deteriorated into a jumbled mess. It is a steep dirt road that became totally inaccessible about halfway up. I carefully drove up as far as I could. Then I had to apply the emergency brake and hike the rest of the way up the top. I then turned south and walked along the ridgeline to where only the concrete pad remained to identify the site. Once there, I sat down, I scanned the valleys on either side of me, and tried to envision what it had been like to work in such a place in the wilderness. I drank some water and munched on peanut butter crackers before making the journey back down the mountainside to my car, which luckily was still securely parked right where I left her. And since there was no way to turn around on that road, it was a slow and careful adventure all in itself to back all the way down that hill. Now, the second high range radar site is a much further drive and is outside Ely, Nevada, in the northeastern portion of the state. It is much higher in the mountains than Beatty, and as I found out, can have snow well into June. After an 8-mile slog up a precipitous dirt road into the mountains, this is what I encountered, just a mile or so short of my goal. Once again, I had to abandon my car and see how far I could get on foot. I'm really glad I had good emergency brakes. As I got nearer, I discovered that the site was actually still in use. I hadn't realized that would be the case. In the end, I decided the most prudent idea was to only see it from afar, as I had no idea what sort of reception I might receive if I walked in unexpectedly on some classified operation. Now, one location that caused me a lot of consternation was getting out to Mud Dry Lake outside Tonopah, Nevada. This was an important site where 4 of the 12 X-15 emergency landings took place, including the most serious of these mishaps when Jack McKay had a near fatal accident there on 9 November 1962. On landing, the left rear skid collapsed, and the X-15 rolled over onto its back, trapping McKay inside. I felt it was important to figure out what it would take to get out there, and it took me several attempts to safely do so. My first try to traverse the 14 miles of dirt roads ended when the clouds opened up with a thunderstorm. I needed my very dry conditions in order to make it a safe trek. I certainly didn't want the name of Mud Lake to become a reality. On my next attempt, I finally met with success, seeing the vista exactly as it had looked 4 decades previously. Here's the same spot in 1966 after Bob Rushworth's final X-15 flight ended in another emergency landing at Mud Lake. I consider this a huge accomplishment, Yet it was a haunting feeling to be out there by myself on that vast, dry, primeval lake bed. Out of this came a unique perspective on the X-15, one that I wanted to share with others. This led to the creation of an actual tour itinerary, one which people today can now follow in order to visit these places themselves. Traveling from where the X-15 was first manufactured at North American Aviation near Los Angeles International Airport to the Antelope Valley where the pilots and others had their homes, to the radar sites and dry lake beds, to the resting places of those people where we can pay our respects for their courage in advancing our knowledge of aerospace, and to revisit the same places that people like pilot Jack McKay went to with their children in the 1950s, such as the beautiful Red Cliffs area where we recreated their iconic image more than a half a century later. The next part of my adventure was to trek across the country, hunting down the X-15 hardware, as well as the X-15 mock-ups that were still in existence. One superb mock-up was used in the filming of the only fictional motion picture to feature the X-15, entitled appropriately enough, X-15. Actually filmed in space, Hollywood would never lie, right? The stars included Charles Bronson and Mary Tyler Moore, who showed off her great fashion sense around a hypersonic aircraft, high heels and all. After filming was complete, this mock-up went into storage until being sent to New York for the 1964-65 World's Fair, where it was on public display for 18 months. During the run of the fair, it was actually taken down and modified into the advanced X-15A2, which included the addition of 2 external tanks. On the real vehicle, these would extend its speed range to nearly an entire Mach number. The World's Fair ended and the mock-up went back into storage, eventually to be acquired by the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, where it still resides today. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, was home to an X-15 mock-up for many years before being donated to the Cosmosphere Museum in Hutchinson, Kansas, which specializes in the restoration of historical aerospace artifacts. It received a new paint job, a new tail number, but never went on display. The Evergreen Museum in McMinnville, Oregon expressed interest and gave it an excellent high-flying home. One last mock-up exists, which was a pet project of X-15 pilot Milt Thompson. Once created, it was mounted to a large pole where it resided for several years until a huge windstorm buckled the fuselage and it had to be removed. It was brought down and is safely now tucked away on the ground until it finds a safe display location, most likely at the new Flight Research Center Museum, now being constructed at Edwards Air Force Base. Now, there were 2 B-52 motherships which carried the X-15 to altitude for the start of each research mission. These were a couple of the very first B-52s ever manufactured, and both of these aircraft still survive today. B-52 number 8 has a new home just outside the northern entrance to Edwards Air Force Base, where it served the X-15 and other research programs for decades. The aircraft lofted the X-15 on 106 of the 199 missions. There is a possibility that the X-15 mock-up at Edwards may eventually be installed onto the wing pylon from where the real X-15s were once launched. I can't think of a better idea. At the propulsion system test facility, the X-15 was bolted into a structure where the rocket engine could then be test fired. Between the 2 test stands was the blockhouse where engineers and technicians would be safe if anything went wrong during the firing. That facility still stands today, although it is now just being used for storage, and the blockhouse has been gutted of all the electronic equipment. The test stands themselves, however, appear still ready to accept another X-15 engine firing with little refurbishment. Now, the second B-52 mothership was retired after 93 X-15 missions and was flown out to Tucson, Arizona. It now resides at the Pima Air and Space Museum, where it has recently undergone a full restoration. When I visited Pima several years ago during that restoration, I was allowed to climb inside and take a look around. These are the pilot and co-pilot stations where legendary aviators such as Fitz Fulton once sat as they flew the X-15 to its launch altitude of approximately 45,000 feet. 3 X-15s were built by North American Aviation to conduct the 10-year-long program of hypersonic research. The number 3 aircraft was lost in November 1967 and took the life of pilot Michael Adams. The number 2 aircraft was modified into what was called the X-15A2, with those external tanks to extend the range and speed of the aircraft. This vehicle now resides at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Here it is seen under the nose of the huge Mach 3 experimental bomber, the XB-70 Valkyrie, which was also built by North American Aviation. The number 1 aircraft was the first to take to the skies on 8 June of 1959, and it performed 81 successful missions during the program through 24 October of 1968, which equates to more than 40% of all flights of the X-15. It now holds a place of honor in American aerospace history and resides suspended from the ceiling of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. That museum is well worth the trip just to see this amazing aircraft up close that flew more than 6 times the speed of sound and higher than 50 miles into space, earning 8 of the X-15 pilots their astronaut wings. When I first started my interviews back in the 1980s, pilot Robert White resided in Germany. We conversed through snail mail, everybody remembers that? Yeah. Across the Atlantic, but nothing can compare to actually sitting down with someone in person. Bob eventually moved back to the US and settled in Florida. He was the last X-15 pilot that I was finally able to sit down with in person in May of 2006. Even though I spoke with others after this date, I consider that cross-country trip to see him as the completion of my primary research to write my book that had started back in September 1983, nearly a quarter of a century earlier. At the time, I considered this the culmination of what I had set out to do, but I had no idea it would still be more than another 5 years until the book would be written and nearly 7 years until it would be published. To get the book done required a lot more than just sitting down and writing it all out. I had to find a publisher, and that took me to my friend Francis French. He co-authored the first 2 books in the Outward Odyssey series from the University of Nebraska Press. One day, we met up at a favorite place called Killer Pizza from Mars in Oceanside. And if you go to Oceanside, you have to go to Killer Pizza from Mars. Everybody has to promise you got to go do. It is just a wonderful place. He asked me that day if I was still working on my X-15 book. I told him yes, but that I had no idea of where to go from here. He said that the University of Nebraska Press was interested to have my book as part of their new series. Things progressed from there by meeting with the Outward Odyssey series creator, Colin Burgess, from Sydney, Australia, then in having to write a book proposal. Now, this was a huge hurdle because at that point, I truly had to get things organized. How was I planning to put together this book? That was the goal. And how would the chapters be laid out? It got me to finally focus on exactly how this would come together into a coherent story. I knew immediately that I didn't want to bore my readers with just a standard chronology. What I finally hit on was to make each chapter as a mini biography of one of the 12 pilots, with an emphasis on their time on the X-15 and how they affected the outcome of the program. With Colin's immense help, and once reviewed, my proposal was accepted. But then things got a little complicated. As at the time the contract came through for signing, I was confined to a nursing home after an incident which cost me two very severely broken legs. Unsure if I would even walk again at this point, I spent 3 months healing and rehabilitating and sat in my wheelchair to sign the contract that day in February of 2009. At the time, I had grave doubts if I would ever be able to do the writing, but I moved forward to give it a chance to happen. Over the next couple of years, as you can see, I was able to overcome the problems and move forward. I started putting it all together and actually got to the writing of the manuscript, completing the introduction on 8 January of 2011 and my first chapter on February 6th. Actually finishing the first chapter, we took a 3-day vacation. I just needed to get away after that. Exactly 6 months later, and just 1 week behind schedule, I completed the book and got it sent off to my publisher. Those months of writing were a real roller coaster. I got very little sleep and rarely left my desk for more than an hour at a time. I needed to write down all those stories that had been bouncing around inside my head for decades. I would write deep into the night, read through it to myself. Then when Cherie was awake, I would have to have her sit down and I would read it out loud to her. There were times I wrote something I thought was brilliant, but Cherie would never let me get away with anything and always bring me back down to earth. Reading it out loud to her was the best thing I could have done. It ensured that everything made sense and was a great way to catch even the smallest of typos and other errors. Colin told me afterwards that he had never received a manuscript requiring almost no editing. The last hurdle was then to find someone to write the foreword for my book. The person who accepted the challenge was X-15 pilot Joe Engel. He became a good friend and we did several events together over the ensuing years. It took me nearly 28 years to get to this point from the moment I first decided to write about the X-15, one that I truly thought would never happen. It was a huge relief to know I had accomplished what I'd set out to do way back in kindergarten. It would be another 20 months until publication actually occurred, but I had my hands full during that time, such as working to put together my website focusing on the X-15 and the book. Another aspect I had never considered a possibility was creating new and distinct artwork that could be used for the book. About 6 years prior to going to print, Tommy Erickson from Gothenburg, Sweden, dropped me an email to introduce himself. He loved the X-15 and was working on some computer images of the aircraft. I asked if he'd like to do some images for my book, and he was all in. With my ideas and Tommy's skills, we worked together to bring the X-15 to life as it has never been seen before. My mandate was to show the X-15 in ways impossible to photograph. Here Tommy shows us what no one else has ever properly depicted, the X-15 in zero gravity, flying in space with experiments deployed, gaining new knowledge for science and exploration, the true purpose of the X-15. And the nickel alloy skin of the X-15, Inconel X, glowing at more than 1,300 degrees during re-entry. I consider Tommy's image, Rocket to Space, as being the perfect book cover. It took a lot of negotiations to convince the University of Nebraska Press to use his artwork. Since Tommy was an unknown artist, they said they would rather use a NASA or Air Force photograph in the program. I insisted that what Tommy had produced was stunning and exemplified the tone of the book as no photograph possibly could. Eventually, they relented, and I am extremely proud of this cover. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Tommy then later used his work on creating these amazing images as the core of his PhD thesis, which he handily and most deservedly received. Now, I wanted to hit the ground running when the book was released, so I developed a talk I could take on the road to help publicize the book, created book cards and flyers, and participated in book fairs. As the time approached for the release of my book, my health took another major turn for the worse. I developed a severe case of kidney stones, which at one point I truly did not think I would survive. Over the course of a month, I experienced a dozen emergency room visits and multiple surgeries. The timing worked out perfectly in that on my return home from the last of my doctor visits on 17 April 2013, Cherie and I came home to see a large box sitting at our front door. We immediately knew what it was. Whatever medical problems I had at that moment, my recovery was complete. I grabbed the box, brought it inside, quickly slicing it open to find the books inside. It was a moment that I had waited for all my life, actually holding a book in my hand that I had written myself, telling the story I never thought I could tell. To this day, it's something I look at and marvel that I was ever able to accomplish any of it. But it is the thing I am most proud of outside the love of my beautiful wife. Hiding back there. Soon after, Colin was flying into Los Angeles from Australia, so we met up at the airport to celebrate. And not long after that, we met up again with Francis to have another great pizza at the place that started the entire publishing process. Without that first conversation with Francis in 2008, the moment of having completed my book might never have happened. 4 days later, visiting the local Barnes & Noble, there was my book on the shelves. The manager asked, and I gladly autographed them for the store. One customer even bought a book right there while I was signing. A long time before this, a few years after I started my research, I started giving talks on the X-15. The very first one was at Vandenberg Air Force Base on the Central California coast on 23 July 1987 as part of their Space Week celebration. I had been led to believe that this would be a high-level talk with officials from the Air Force and other bigwigs. So I prepared a huge technical slide presentation. Yes, actual slides in a projector in those days. When everything was set and the audience started to file into their seats, instead of a lot of military uniforms, in walked a bunch of school kids. To say it was a total disaster is a complete understatement. I learned a huge lesson that day and have been fortunate to never have a repeat of an event like that. Later that year, I did my talk for the Rockwell Family Night event at the Downey Space Division. This is the company that was previously known as North American Aviation and had manufactured the X-15 back in the late 1950s. This talk went much better and was very well received. One of the first people I interviewed for my book, flight planner Jack Kolf, attended that evening, and it was an exciting time. It also included the first display that I created, including models and photographs from the X-15 program. Years later, once the book came out, I developed a whole new presentation based on the manuscript itself, so it benefits from my years of research and includes quotes from many of the people I interviewed. That talk has now carried me throughout the United States and even across the world. I have currently given 170 talks in 21 states, the Washington, D.C. area, 6 countries, and on 5 continents. One of the most amazing locations where I have done my presentation has to be in January 2023 in Antarctica. The ship had just left the Antarctic Peninsula an hour before as we started back across the infamous Drake Passage toward Argentina. The waves pounded the World Traveler. The Vasco da Gama Theater where I spoke was at the bow of the ship, and water crashed against the hull just yards away under my feet. The waves sent resonant vibrations, causing me to grab onto the podium, which was not bolted to the floor. I held on for dear life. After I finished the talk, my palms were literally black and blue with bruises. But apparently everyone loved the presentation, though, as I had people come up to me after congratulating throughout the voyage home, even at the airport days later in Buenos Aires. One event I'm most proud of happened in Tucson at Space Fest in 2017. I had spoken there several times previously on the X-15, but that year I wanted to do something unique. Instead of simply doing a normal talk, I was able to organize a panel discussion, which included X-15 pilot Joe Engle, as well as 4 engineers from the program. This is the only time I'm aware of where anything like this has ever happened. Even surpassing the experience I would have years later in Antarctica, those 2 hours with Joe, Wayne, Charlie, Harry, and Vince will probably be the most amazing hours of my life. A close second would be when Joe Engle and I spent the day at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs doing multiple talks to the command staff, instructors, and cadets. Every location and every talk has been a wonderful experience. Here I am at one of my very first talks after the book's publication at the Leonard Nimoy Event Horizon Theater at Griffith Park Observatory. And it's impossible for me to explain just how exciting it is to do these presentations for air and space museums, pilot and engineering organizations, university students, local libraries, civic groups, and community centers. Examples include the Florida Institute of Technology, which included 2 space shuttle astronauts in the audience with Winston Scott and Sandy Magnus, and the Western Museum of Flight, where I have now spoken 3 times. Just an amazing place. On my first talk there was a really special thing that happened. As I was setting up, a man came up to me and said, "I know you've never heard of me, but I worked on the X-15 program. My name is Bob Hayos, and I created the attitude sensor on the nose of the X-15 when I worked at a company called Nortronics." Even though I'd never met Bob before, I knew exactly who he was. I said, "Bob, I know who you are, and you are in my book." He was taken aback. So I grabbed a copy, I opened the index and showed Bob his name was listed there. Bob was over 90 years old at that time, and it was a marvelous thing to watch him light up when he saw that. This event was also special in that it is where I was the first able to display a huge 1/15 scale X-15 model, which you can see in the back of the room today as well. This model was actually at Edwards Air Force Base during the time of the X-15. After the program ended, it was donated to the California Museum of Science and Industry, now known more simply as the California Science Center. As it was being delivered, the model was dropped and broke into many, many pieces. The museum thought it beyond repair. Luckily, instead of just throwing it away, they instead locked it into a storage room where it sat for more than 20 years. When it was uncovered, a docent there, who happened to be a friend of mine, suggested donating it to me, as I might be able to somehow get it all put back together. It took me a long time, but that finally happened, especially with the efforts of a good friend and master model maker, John Page Risk. I was invited to Palm Springs to speak at the Palm Springs Air Museum. They not only rolled out the red carpet for me, but actually rolled in an F-104 Starfighter that was in their collection and had been used as a chase plane on the X-15 program. The cockpit was open, and in I went to have a vicarious and very unexpected experience that day of sitting in the pilot seat of a Mach 2 fighter plane. I then came back down to earth and gave my X-15 talk at the Bob Hope stage at the museum. In addition to my initial talk, I have since developed several other presentations. These include a special talk about pilot Michael Adams, who lost his life during the only fatal accident of the X-15 program. Additionally, I've hosted movie screenings of the 1961 motion picture X-15, as well as showing various documentaries about the research program, such as a great NBC News special from 1981 entitled The Rocket Pilots. And we'll be showing some of those films at the afternoon session here today. Another very special event was at the Joe Walker Middle School at Quartz Hill in California's Antelope Valley, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the school named in honor of X-15 pilot Joe Walker. I was given the school's gym in order to set up a large display and to give my talks to each class as they cycled in throughout the day. My voice was cracking and almost gone by the afternoon, but amazingly, I made it through all the talks. And I was just up there actually a few weeks ago for their career day and did it all over again. It's a wonderful place. After each presentation, I invited the students to all come up and get a close-up look at the models, photographs, and X-15 artifacts. Cherie was by my side throughout it all to help. I spoke with literally every student and faculty member as part of their education experience, which also featured NASA pilots, educators, and 12 members of Joe Walker's family. I presented a specially signed copy of my book to the school, which was placed into a time capsule that will be opened by students in 2077. It's a wonderful thought to know that students a half century from now, long after I'm gone, will get to know the story of amazing people like Joe Walker and his fellow X-15 pilots. Another fascinating experience that has come out of all this is that I'm now being asked to take people on my special tour in the footsteps of the X-15. It includes stops such as lunch at Domingo's restaurant in Boron, where you can have a special drink that will singe your eyebrows called the Boron Rocket Fuel. Dangerous, but tasty. Domingo's is close to Edwards Air Force Base and is famous as a place where pilots and astronauts love to drop by, although on this day we only had a two-dimensional Neil Armstrong stop by to say hello. We went by the Edwards North Base entrance to visit the B-52 mothership, then on to visit Cuddyback Dry Lake. It's the closest dry lake to Edwards, where two emergency landings occurred. It's a vast and wide open terrain, which lends itself perfectly as a wonderful place to dance. After Cuddyback, we headed north to a more somber location, the Michael Adams Memorial. There are many monuments in the desert around Edwards to commemorate accidents that have occurred over the decades during flight test research, but there's nothing quite like what we have accomplished in honor of Mike Adams. In May of 2004, Eagle Scout candidate John Badelsky first created this memorial on it as his community project. A huge crowd came to the desert that day to pay their respects to Mike, and as I mentioned previously, this event was pivotal to my research for completing my X-15 book. Over the years, several expansions have taken place, primarily accomplished by Rob Enriquez of the Bureau of Land Management, Bob Klein, and myself. Also provided new display boards to help tell the story of the site. And in November of 2017, a new expansion was unveiled as part of the event honoring Mike on the 50th anniversary of the accident. I also created a new presentation specifically about his life, his work on the X-15, and his legacy. It was first presented at the Matarango Museum in Ridgecrest, about 20 miles north of the crash site. The following day, there were a couple of hundred people who joined us to learn more about Mike's life. Domingo himself was there and provided food and drink for everyone present, although no rocket fuel. X-15 rocket shop technician Dave Stoddard was with us that day. He had been instrumental in locating the exact site where the accident happened, so that the monument could be created. Here he shows us an X-15 artifact recovered from the site. Dave was one of the people I met back in 2004 at the original dedication, and he greatly assisted in connecting me to so many others who worked on the X-15. And Dave passed away when he was 94 years old, and he passed on several of his artifacts to me. And in fact, the one that he's holding in his hand right there, you can see on the far right table in the back. So I want to thank Dave for all that he did. Now this image shows 2 of the 4 large display boards I created to tell visitors about the X-15, the people involved that made it all happen, and about Mike and the accident that took his life. Present that day were 2 representatives of Mike's family, his son Brent and nephew Dave. Immediately following the event that morning, we all went a few miles south to the Randsburg Opera House. The town has a population of just 65 people. Yet that afternoon, we packed the 1885 Opera House to capacity to hear about Major Adams and the X-15. Sitting in the front row were Brent and Dave. To say that I never was more nervous about giving a talk would be a severe understatement. I hope that they would appreciate the story I told of Mike, and afterward I was very relieved when they said I had definitely done him justice. I originally thought I would only give the talk once or twice, but today I continue to be asked to give this talk as part of the presentations I do about the X-15. My analysis of the accident has been used by engineering students and also the cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Over the years, since the Adams site has been expanded exponentially, people have come from all over the world to seek out this spot and pay homage to Mike. It is monitored by the BLM as well as myself and many others to protect its legacy, the legacy of the X-15 and all those involved in the program. The upper left corner there, that sign was just installed just about a month ago. Really proud of that sign. It took us a year to finally get that one up there. Since then, I have been a technical consultant on the movie First Man and also for National Geographic Television's The Real Right Stuff. In addition, I had a profile in both the Orange County Register as well as Newsweek magazine. The Museum of Flight in Seattle interviewed me for their oral history program. This has all been made possible because of the X-15 and is something that I never envisioned when I started the project back in 1983. And I recently just completed another oral history project for the Library of Congress, which I was very honored to do. I'm often asked what book I'm working on next, and the answer is always that I spent 30 years out there on my own obsessing over the research and writing of this book about a program that achieved a record speed of 4,520 miles per hour and attained an altitude of 354,200 feet. Now, I can't imagine a more fulfilling thing to do than to be out there talking with a lot of people about that program. This is the X-15 rocket plane flying the first wings into space. For me, this adventure is just beginning, and I want to thank you all for being with me today to share in this journey. I would be happy to answer any questions. And I do have to mention, by the way, this little baby Belle, she's reading my book. That book is less than ½ an inch tall. And I have a friend, Bob Klein, he couldn't be with us today. He's helped out with putting together displays for me and stuff. And he created a reproduction of my book cover that at ½ inch tall, if you got a microscope, you could actually read. So can't say enough about what Bob has done. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thank you so much for being here today. Anybody have anything they'd like to ask? About the program, the journey, anything at all? Yes.
How do you go about requesting interviews for the pilots?
Basically, it was just trying to locate them. I would often just send them letters. A lot of it came about because of Dr. Hallian. He was instrumental in this. As I say, he set up that first interview with Milt by just simply calling over to his office. And after that, he gave me several addresses to write to, including the one for Neil Armstrong, which was incorrect. But it was a small enough town that my letter got to Neil. I had no idea the address was off until I arrived that day. It was a really amazing morning for me. I sent the letter off. A couple weeks later, I was literally walking out the door to go to my job, and the phone rang. And I went to answer the phone, and it was Neil. Wasn't his secretary or anything. It was Neil Armstrong himself. I was like, yeah, I got your letter, and I just thought I'd talk to you and see more about your project. And he basically grilled me for about a half an hour to make sure I knew what I was talking about before he finally said, sure, come on down. And that was just an amazing trip. Flew into Washington, D.C., did Scott Crossfield at the Rayburn office building, went to Forrest Peterson in Virginia, and then drove out to Ohio for Neil. So it was great. And again, same thing with so many of these other people that I talked to. I had the address for Bob White overseas, and we exchanged the snail mail back and forth across the Atlantic. But it was so much better to sit down with him in person that day. And it was great excuse to do a cross-country trip too. I also spent time with Frida Adams and her sons, Brent and Mike Jr., in Louisiana. So I was doing a lot of great stuff on that trip. It was really fun because when I went in there, I had set up, my reservations at the motels and stuff. And I sat down with Frida, and it's like, you're not staying in the motel. You will be staying here with me and my husband. And she had remarried at the time and stuff. Pearl Harbor survivor, her husband was. And talk about Southern hospitality. That was an amazing visit with them. So, yeah. Yes.
Your writing period was arduous. Were you able to share chapters in progress with the families of the pilots?
Good question. He asked about saying the writing process was arduous, and did I have a chance to share the chapters as I wrote them with the families and such. And actually, yes, I did. I didn't share them with them until I had finished the original manuscript. And then I started to contact people like the McKay family. I sent my chapter to Grace Walker. She was still with us at that time. Sent it to Bob Rushworth and to down to Bob White, people like that. And so, yeah, I was able to get signed off by most everyone that I could in that time. It's one of the sad things today, of course, is that many of the people that I've interviewed are long gone. And the list of the people who are still with us gets shorter and shorter almost every day. And I interviewed more than 70 people for this project over the years. And we're down to somewhere in like the 20 people left at this point. And it was really neat. You saw the picture toward the beginning of Jim Townsend, and he was sitting there in his wheelchair. And that turned out to be one of my favorite interviews with him. I went up to Tehachapi. His son had told me, it's like, he's got Alzheimer's. He's not in good health, but if you want to come up and talk to him, come on up. And so, yeah, we sat there that day, and his son, and he actually brought over another friend of his who worked on the program as well. And we sat down and we talked all afternoon, and you saw him there. I don't know if you noticed in the picture, but there was like a little box with like a little throttle thing on it that was on his wheelchair. Jim ran the propulsion system test facility at Edwards, and on his retirement, they gave him the throttle box for the XLR 99 engines, and he mounted that to his wheelchair. So he was very proud of that. And about 2 weeks later, I got a call from his son, and he was telling me that Jim had just passed away, and he wanted to thank me because he said that he had not seen his father more with it, more there than he had in years than we did that day. So it was really amazing to be part of that and to be able to help Jim in that small way as he helped me to be able to tell his story and so many others. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Do you know what the scenario was for the chase planes following the X-15?
The scenario for the chase planes following the X-15, usually you had, whenever they had to leave the local area, you had at least two chase planes with the aircraft itself, and then you had another couple of chase planes that would hang out more down at Edwards, so they would hang out closer to the landing site. So you would have what they would call a high chase and a low chase when they were doing the launching. So you literally had somebody sitting off a wing and another one who would be down low to watch the drop itself to make sure everything was lighting up correctly and it looked like everything was fine, so they could inform the pilot if something didn't look right. And then if everything went fine on that, the X-15, of course, once the engine turned on, it would head up into space pretty quickly and leave those chase planes behind. So the launch chase would then head as quickly as they could down along the flight path in case of possibly being needed along the path at an emergency landing lake or anything like that. But they couldn't make it all the way back to Edwards in time because the whole flight from the launch to the landing, they're about 300 miles away from Edwards at the farthest point, and the X-15 covered that distance in around 10 minutes. So that's why they had to have the other chase planes at the landing site of Edwards Air Force Base. And again, they would be there to help guide the pilot in, give him readings, tell him how high up he was, so they could just augment his own senses from the cockpit of the X-15 and help guide him in for a nice smooth touchdown on the lake bed.
So what planes were used? I saw a T-38 and F-100, and you said the F-104. Any other planes used for chase?
Yeah, T-38 was used a lot. The F-104 was used a lot. The F-100, I believe, was only used a few times. There was an F-4 that was used one time, and that's it. Let's see, am I missing anybody? Yeah, I think the F-104 was the one that was used the most. Pretty much whatever they had available, but those were the primary aircraft. It just seems like I'm missing one, but I can't think of what it is offhand. But yeah, the F-104, F-100, T-38, F-4, those are the primaries. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. I'm online. My name is Adrian. In March of 1966, I believe, when I was 13 years old, I had the incredible opportunity to actually observe another incredible aircraft, the XB-70. When it actually flew, I believe it was the only time it ever flew out of Edwards into Carswell Air Force Base at Fort Worth, Texas, for I believe it was the Air Force Association, and it had an air show there. And I was able to walk underneath it and actually watch that take off when it was on its return back to Edwards. I believe maybe Al White was the pilot at the time. I'm not entirely sure about that. But the reason I'm asking is because at that same air show, there was a what I kind of believe now might have been one of the mock-ups, but it was an X-15. It was on the back of a flatbed. It was the model with the external tanks. And so I was just wondering if you had any record of that, and if it was actually I presume now that it was one of the mock-ups and not one of the actual X-15s. So just curious if you might have had records of that. Like I said, that was an incredible day. I'll never forget being able to see that incredible XB-70 machine and walking underneath that cockpit high above me and that kind of extended nose gear. That was an incredible opportunity to see that aircraft. But I was just curious if you had any records as to the displays of some of those mock-ups and if that was one of them present at that day.
I don't have any record of it being at Carswell, but it certainly, in 65.
No, 66. March 1966.
Yeah, I would probably say what you saw was the X-15, which had been used in the movie X-15, was then used at the New York World's Fair, and it probably was being transferred across country and made a stop at Carswell for the air show on its way to Pima Air and Space Museum. that would be just about the right timing for that, from what I would assume. That sounds just about what it would probably be. So I have a feeling you saw that New York World's Fair aircraft and the one used in the movie. So
I see.
yeah, I would love to see pictures of it at Carswell. I don't have any of those. Carswell is famous as being the location of a really fantastic Jimmy Stewart movie. If you remember Strategic Air Command, and he flew B-36s and B-47s out of Carswell. So that's pretty cool. You got to see that there. I wish you'd taken some pictures.
Yeah, I've seen the movie, and well, that was where a lot of the B-36s were manufactured at the plants out there in Fort Worth, and for a long time there was one on display out there close to the base. I believe that's been gone now for quite a number of years, but as a kid, I remember going out there any number of times. But yeah, that was an incredible experience, being able to see the that other fateful, and I believe that was the AV2, which was actually the B-70 that was lost again with a collision with the F-104 in the Nevada desert there. So kind of a sad ending for that incredible aircraft. But anyway, I just had that question, so I enjoyed very much your presentation, sir. That was or whatever. That was really fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I also have, as a kid, an X-15 fan, and some of the information you presented was really incredible. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome, and thank you. I hope you get a chance to read the book. Very, very proud of what we've done. So you'll learn a lot more than what I could tell you in a presentation. There was another back here.
I know that the pilots did a lot of joking around with each other. And I know you have a lot of stories that different pilots told you, things that happened. Could you tell us one about, Neil Armstrong, or, somebody like that, that is a funny story that is everyday happening?
Well, this is what's called a setup. Thank you, Cherie. Neil was the 7th pilot who flew on the program, and he flew 7 missions on the program before he left. And the last couple of missions that he flew, he did not do a really great job on those missions, and he basically screwed up a lot. So it got to the point where he made one mistake after another, and his boss, Paul Bickle, was really on the verge of firing him. To give you an idea of what happened, was the first incident was on the X-15 itself, where he flew a mission, he went on a ballistic arc and was coming back down, and during the re-entry, as the air is getting thicker, he was watching one gauge, and that was his G meter, and he was trying to hold 4 Gs on the airframe. Now the problem with this is, that's fine when you're up at high altitude, but as you get lower and lower and more air, it takes, the air pressure to get to 4 Gs, it ended up pushing him back up out of the atmosphere. And of course, that was not part of the plan. He was supposed to get to a certain point and then release the stick so that it could just come back and he could fly into Edwards. And so he flew back up out of the atmosphere, where of course he has no control. He has the ballistic control system so he can move the aircraft, but he can't fly the aircraft. You needed aerodynamics for that. You need air to do that. And he couldn't do that. And it was about the time he was flying right over the top of Edwards when they called up to him and said, "Where are you going?" And he flew right off over the south of the Antelope Valley and went over the San Fernando Valley before he finally got low enough that he got enough air resistance that he could start to use the controls, and got turned around and headed back north again. and he passed over the hills between the San Fernando Valley and the Antelope Valley at about 45,000 feet. So he was plenty high over the range, but he still had a ways to go to get into Edwards. And remember that the X-15 has the glide characteristics of a brick. So he really was trying to stretch it to get back in there. Neil ended up making it barely to the very south end of Rogers Dry Lake Bed, which is where all the landings took place at Edwards. And he landed something like within less than 1,000 feet inside the southern boundary. And it took like over a half an hour before anybody could get down to him. He was so far away. He had a flight that lasted nearly 13 minutes. And as I say, the normal flight time is like around 10. So he really stretched that. That was by far the longest flight on the X-15 program. After that, he screwed up again he was also spending time on the X-20 dinosaur program. And he had a flight that he was supposed to catch to go up to Seattle because the X-20 was being built by Boeing. And as he was walking out the door, again, it was Joe Venzel stopped him and said, Neil, I need you to go up. We've got an X-15 flight going, and we need you to go up and check out one of the lake beds because we don't know if it can support an X-15 emergency landing. You know, they have this whole series of dry lake beds along the flight path, so there's always a place to land. And he was really adamant, no, I have to leave. And Joe, who was the pilot boss, said, you will do what I tell you to do and go make that flight up there, and you will find out if the lake bed can support this or not. And Chuck Yeager ended up being in the back seat of that airplane with Neil, and they flew up to that lake bed together, and they flew around the lake bed, and Chuck was telling Neil, I don't think that lake bed is dry enough. There's been rains recently, that's why we need to check it out, and I don't think it's dry enough to land on. And Neil's like, oh no, it's gonna be fine. I just wanna get this over with and get back so I can get on my trip up to Seattle. And Neil touched down on the airplane and promptly sank into the mud. Actually, I have pictures of that thing, of the landing gear way down deep in the mud. And as they came to a very quick halt, the only thing Neil could hear was over his headset from behind his seat was Chuck Yeager laughing his head off at him. And so those are the kind of things that he did. And yeah, it came very, very close to him being fired. Paul Bickle was definitely on the verge of it. Neil knew he was in trouble for doing these things. He wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. That's why he kept screwing up. And I guess I should throw in the third incident that was the final straw also. He went up to check out another lake bed for an X-15 flight. He was in an F-104, and he was by himself this time. So he came down and he realized that he was too low before he dropped his landing gear. And he popped his landing gear out just before he hit the dirt. He was not looking at his altitude correctly. And if you are familiar with the F-104, the landing gear comes down from the center and out. And I have a really great picture where they were checking out afterwards. The landing gear, it's supposed to come out like this. It came out like that. That's as far as it went. And that, along with the bottom of the aircraft, started hitting the lake bed. There's a nice shot of the lake bed being torn up by the F-104. The ventral was ripped off the bottom of the F-104. It released an arresting hook at the back of the aircraft. It ripped out all of his radio antennas. When he was able to get up enough speed, he actually did not crash. He was able to pull it up. Finally, the gear popped out all the way, but he knew he was in trouble because all he had was red lights going all over the place, and his radio didn't work because the antennas were gone. And he had no idea that the arrestor hook was hanging out the back, which was a bit of a problem later because the nearest place for him to land was at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. So he said, I got to get in there. They didn't know he was coming because he couldn't radio him. He shows up at the runway, comes in for a touchdown, and that arrestor hook took out the arrestor cable at the end of the runway as he, on the approach end of the runway at 200 miles an hour, grabbed that thing, drug it down. Oh, it was just ripped it completely out, drug it down the runway, closed everything down. It was a total disaster. Paul gets a call from, as he called it, the aerodrome officer at Nellis, and told him what happened and said, please send somebody up here to get your guy off of our base. And they flew, Milt Thompson went up there in a 2-seat F-104 to pick up Neil, and he blew his tires when he landed and held up the whole place again. So the aerodrome officer called Paul another time and said, you know what? We'll get them back to you. Please don't send any more of your people here. And as Paul told me, it was just a disgraceful event all around. And so at that point, Neil decided that he probably was not in Paul's good graces anymore. And that's when he put in his application to go to the astronaut office in Houston. And he did not put Paul Bickle down as a reference. But when the application got there, the people at NASA at Houston did call Paul anyway. And Paul said, I don't think you should hire him. But they decided to go ahead and do so. And the rest is history. And most people look at Neil and say, oh my God, he must be the most fantastic pilot who ever flew because he was the first man on the moon. And that's one thing that I was interested in telling in my story about Neil in the book was that, no, he's not quite what you might think of from the history books. So, and that's what you get throughout the book is that was one of the big turning points in my book was trying to figure out how to tell that story. And when I hit on that, it's like we got 12 pilots. Gee, I'll do 12 chapters. And so each one is in the order of their first flight, Scott Crossfield and Joe Walker and Bob White, etc., on down the line. Yes?
Well, that might explain why Neil was the first man on the moon. Because in a talk from Buzz Aldrin, he was giving accolades about Neil, and he said, "I've never seen a man with nerves of steel like Neil, and he must have developed them because he had all these incidents and made it. See, and so it was no big deal to be the first man to, because one of the final things he said to Buzz as they're landing, he says, I think we're going to be a little long, and he says he's looking at him like he does this every day.
Oh yeah.
that was Buzz's take on Neil. So that explains a lot right there. All the incidents that he had right there.
Neil was a very interesting guy. He was a wonderful man. You didn't really know him unless you were close to him. And he was very reluctant to talk to people. I mean, it's like when I first talked to him, I mean, how many people asked him for interviews and tell us what it felt like to walk on the moon? You know, he must have gotten that question 1,000 times or more, probably a lot more. And it was one of the things when I sent him my letter where it's like, I want to talk to you about the X-15. And it's like, gee, nobody wants to talk about the X-15. And so he was all on board with that. If I just said I wanted to talk about the moon landing, he would have never even answered me. And if you ever talk to Neil afterward too, you'd find out that the X-15 was the program he preferred. He really loved that X-15. He was an engineer at heart, and he was a pilot, and the engineering and the piloting of the X-15 was the thing he liked more than anything he did in his career. And I should also throw in the caveat to tell you the reason why he screwed up so badly on the X-15. It wasn't just that he lost focus. It was from an absolutely tragic incident in his life that those things came out of that. And that is in January of 1962. And those incidents I talked about all happened in the spring of 1962. In January of 62, he lost his daughter. He and his wife, Jan, lost their daughter. She was 6 years old. She died of brain cancer. It was just a horrific thing. And one of the problems with Neil was the fact that he never, ever talked about his emotions, like what's it like to be on the moon? I don't want to talk about that. I never talk about that. He never did. And it took 30 years, but his wife divorced him in the 1990s because of the fact that over those 30 years, he still had not dealt with the loss of his daughter. And it was bottled up inside, and it affected his job so much. But it was when they got away from that location where they had lost their daughter and got to Houston, then he was able to refocus on things and move forward. And if you ever have a chance to read the biography of Neil called First Man by James Hansen, I highly recommend it. I will also give the caveat that I do not recommend the movie based on the book. The movie was... Thank you. Yes. And I was a technical advisor on the movie. I say that from a personal experience. Those people, yeah, they really screwed up the story a lot. It's like on that flight where he passed over the hills going back into Antelope Valley at 45,000 feet. In the movie, they showed him at about 10,000 feet and hitting the tops of the trees. No. I could get into a whole diatribe about First Man, but read the book. Excellent, excellent book. Movie, no, don't worry about it. So.
I was hoping you were going to select the one about Pete Knight and the flowers.
Oh, well, you asked about Neil.
Well.
Okay, I'll tell you. Well, it's actually not Pete so much as it was Mike Adams. That's one of the things. Mike Adams was a very stoic person. You didn't really get to see his fun side unless you knew him really well either. And even his best friends and pilot buddies and stuff didn't quite understand his sense of humor, so much that Mike was leaving on a temporary duty assignment one time, and he went to his fellow pilot, Pete Knight, and he said, could you do me a favor and stop by my house, because my wife's going to be with me and stuff. The house is going to be empty. Can you please go in and water all the plants for me while I'm going to be gone? I don't want my plants to die. So Pete's like, well, sure, I'll help out, no problem. And so Pete goes in there and gets his water can and he starts watering the plants. And after a few minutes of this, he realized all the plants were plastic. So that's the kind of people, there were a lot of interesting people on the X-15. That was just some of them. I'll tell you another quick story, which has nothing to do with the pilots, but has to do why it was so important to talk to the guys in the trenches, the mechanics, those guys, the people who made it all happen. Without those mechanics, the rocket shop guys and stuff, nothing would ever get off the ground. And that one day when I had 17 of them in one room together with the video camera running was a really great day, because one of the guys brought up this thing that he started to tell the story. There was a guy in their shop who wanted to build a new lamp. And so he was in the hangar over lunch, and he was going through this pile of leftover metal and stuff in a trash can, and he found this pipe in there that was like, oh, this will make the great stem for my lamp. So he picked it out, and he stuck it in a vise, and he was going to hacksaw it to the right length when it lit off. It was a separation motor for the external tanks for the X-15, and it had not been fully fired, and there was still propellant in it, and it blew off, and it left the clamp, and it went up and it hit the ceiling and bounced off and went through and hit a window frame, broke a window, and popped back. It was like a Roadrunner cartoon, bang, boom, boom, you know, all over the place. Amazingly, in this hangar full of aircraft, he was the only guy that was there at the time until some other guys came in just as it was occurring. And it did not hit anybody. It did not hit any aircraft. It was amazing. But I actually had pictures, and I didn't quite know what it was about because I'd seen the pictures of this damaged hangar when they broke the window out. And so this guy's telling the story about it. And it's like, oh, now I know what you're talking about. But it was great because then he told his story, and then the next guy would jump in with his part of the story. Then the next guy would jump in with his part, and it was just going around the room. Everybody had this story. And it was just, they would just keep adding to it and stuff. So it was a very famous incident in there. And those are the kind of things that I really, really love putting into the book and stuff to help show these people for who they are and what they did. One thing I always, they were human? I had no idea. One of the things they always complained about is that people loved their job so much that they would come in even when they were deathly ill. But they didn't want to miss a day at work, so they just pass it on to everybody else. But that's the way they were. They were truly, absolutely a family. They really, really were. I've never met a group of people who were closer together. And the ones who are still around, they're still in touch. And that was what was so great, like being able to take some of those guys and put them together with Joe Engel and go do that Space Fest panel. It was such a day to be able to sit there and do that. And I got to tell you, one of the most wonderful moments in my entire life was at the end of that talk. I'm sitting there fielding the questions and stuff and passing them off to people, and Joe is sitting right next to me. And when the thing was finished, that room stood up in this huge ovation that just went on and on and on. And I sat there and I leaned over to Joe and I said, "This is for you," because Joe had never gone out and done anything like this before. And he turned back to me and he tapped my knee and he said, "No, Michelle, this is for you." And it's like, he didn't need to say that. That's the kind of person he was. He was amazing. Joe was the last of the X-15 pilots. He died last July. He's been gone now 11 months, and we miss him dearly. He was an amazing man. I cannot say enough about him. And I was heartbroken in the fact that I was supposed to go to Arlington for his interment in March, and I was prevented from going by the current administration. And I will never forgive them for what they did. But I was not able to be there that day, and I couldn't be there for Jeannie or any of the other people either. But that's another story. And Joe is the only one who made it into his 90s out of the whole group. He was 91 when he passed away. So great guy. Anyway, sorry, I go on about these people forever. Sorry. Any other questions?
There's a question from Mr. Rich Wagner. He could not speak out, so this is
Okay.
question.
How did you support yourself financially during the creation of the book? Oh, that's a good question. I've never gotten that question before. That's a good one. I like that one.
I worked.
Well, I worked too. I had a full-time job when I started this. I worked at a company called Endevco down in San Juan Capistrano. It's where I first moved to Orange County. And I was out of the Air Force for just a year when I changed jobs and went down to Endevco. And I worked there for 11 years. And that's where I first got the idea to write the book. And so I had my regular paycheck from that. And so, yeah, I was working full-time most of the time there. I went to another couple of companies. After that, I worked for a computer company for a bit, and then I worked for Meade Instruments, a telescope company. And after that, I finally decided enough was enough, and I left the corporate world. And it was a very tough time, to say the least. for a while trying to do things on my own, but it was worth it in the end. And I'm just so glad because I never would have been able to get it done, I think, if I had stayed working full time. So, yeah. So, and now we're on the other end of that, and I'm officially retired, but I think I'm working harder now than I ever have been because I'm out doing all these talks. Just a few weeks ago, I was up, I mentioned I did a career day for Joe Walker Middle School. I also had a 3-night event in Ridgecrest. That was a great time. And I did 9 talks in 7 days. So it definitely keeps me busy. And working with Ken and AIAA, since the pandemic, I'm not doing the talks that I used to do for AIAA. I used to fly all over the country doing talks for them, but that sort of died after the pandemic. I'm still doing an occasional Zoom talk for them, but not as much as we used to do. And doing Zoom just isn't quite the same as being there in person. So, and for all of you people that are out there listening out on the internet, you're missing this really great display. Wish you could be here today, and a lot of great people as well. So, yes.
I noticed when I was looking into the history of it that some of the pilots were Air Force, one was Navy, and a few were NASA. How did the pilot selection work with some of them being military and some of them being civilian?
Great question. He's asking about the pilots and how they were chosen and the organizations they were with. We had one contractor pilot, Scott Crossfield, who worked for North American Aviation. He did 14 flights on the program, just checking out the airplane, making sure that everything was there that they were supposed to do. Then Joe Walker came in with NASA, and he was the prime pilot for NASA for several years. Then we had several other pilots for NASA. We had Jack McKay, Neil Armstrong, and Bill Dana, and now I'm having a brain freeze. But then we also had the Air Force pilots, started out with Bob White and Bob Rushworth, Joe Engle, Mike Adams, and we had one single Navy pilot, Admiral Forrest Peterson. And what had happened was that the way the program was set up was absolutely unique because every research aircraft program that had been run before had been done so that like the Air Force would have a research project they wanted to do. So they would fund an aircraft. And then when they finished whatever they wanted to do with it, if the aircraft still survived, they might turn it over to NASA, and then NASA could do a few things with it. And the Navy did that as well. They had their D558 Phase 1 and Phase 2 programs. And again, when they were finished, we'll give it to NASA. So NASA was always the poor stepchild. The X-15 was absolutely unique, and what happened there was the program came out of NASA. They're the ones who instigated the program. We need to do hypersonic research. Nobody had ever flown hypersonically before, which means above Mach 5. And so they instigated the program. But their budget, and I should say, I should actually back up because it's actually not NASA at this point. It's NACA, or NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And so they came out and they had a tiny, tiny budget. So what they did was they partnered with the Air Force. And he said, we're going to manage the program and the Air Force is going to pay for the program. And that worked out really well, except that even the Air Force still could not quite come up with enough money to run everything perfectly. So they also said, you know, well, how about if we bring in the Navy? Because the Navy wanted to run a hypersonic program as well. So let's bowl it all into one place. And they brought in the one pilot, Forrest Peterson, and he was part of it. When he left the program, the Navy was basically shut out at that point. They did not have any other Navy pilots. And Scott Crossfield also put in the idea that he should be the only one to fly the X-15 at one point because he knew the thing intimately. He had left NACA in order to go work on the program with the winning company, which was North American. And it's like, I know this thing better than anybody, so I should fly everything. And again, NASA running it, Air Force paying for it. So it's like, no, you will leave now. You've done your stuff. We're taking over the program. And So that's basically how it worked as far as how they funded it and how they chose the pilots. The Air Force usually got their guys out of the test pilot school. The guy running the test pilot school at the time was some guy named Chuck Yeager, and he made some recommendations. Chuck Yeager actually tried to get on the X-15 program himself, and NASA said, no way you can do that, because he just wanted it basically for the publicity. And it's like, no, this is a serious research program. He even went so far as to try to get Jackie Cochran to fly the X-15 as a publicity stunt one time, and that really got shut down very quickly as well. So yeah, there was a lot of interesting things going on in the selection and stuff as well. So yeah, you had the first people, and then you had sort of the second batch that came along later. And the last pilots who flew the program were Pete Knight and Bill Dana. They also had Mike Adams was part of that, but he died a year before the program ended. So the last year was just Pete and Bill that finished out the program. Yes, dear.
Why no women pilots?
Because at the time there was no women pilots qualified because they weren't allowed to be in those programs. They had no ability to fly in combat, to get the advanced training, things like that. And so
what about people like Jerry Cobb and you know, Amelia Earhart? You know,
Amelia Earhart was long gone at that point here. And she's still gone. No, they needed people with jet experience, high Mach experience. These people were like pilots in the F-104 that was like a Mach 2 aircraft, things like that. That's what they were looking for at the time. It's an unfortunate fact of the way things were at that time that there just weren't any women that were allowed to go into the programs that would give them the experience. And now they're trying to take away those programs for them as well, unfortunately. So yeah, I wonder what Eileen Collins, the first space shuttle commander, women's space shuttle commander, would think about that. And I'll just throw in a thing too. If you have Nat Geo, try to watch the new documentary that just came out on Monday on Sally Ride. That was really a great program too, if you haven't seen it. So, did I answer your question? Okay.
Hi, Michelle. This is Adrian back again.
Yeah.
I was curious. Are you planning on maybe doing another book? My suggestion would be, as I spoke about earlier, the XB-70. That would be a wonderful chapter in aviation history to perhaps also document in a similar type of story.
There's already a book.
Well, there are several books out there on the B-70. There's no books that were written in the way that I wrote mine, which really focused on the people. Unfortunately, most of the people who could be able to tell that story are no longer with us. That's certainly one of the unique things about my book, is I started this interview process so long ago that these people were still around, and I got very, very lucky on being able to talk with so many of them. There was a point when I actually did have another book in mind that I thought I was going to get started on. And it was going to be on the McDonnell Douglas Delta Clipper program, the DCX. And I started looking into it. I started getting my ducks in a row to maybe start that. I knew several of the people who were on the program. The chief person on the DCX was a guy named Bill Gobbets, who was a good friend of mine. And there was another guy, Jeff Laube, and another guy by the name of Pete Conrad, who you might recognize the name, who was an astronaut, flew on Apollo 12, things like that. Really, really great guy. And unfortunately, you know, Pete was already gone. He died in a motorcycle accident. That's a whole other stupid story. But Bill, I thought, was absolutely critical to the story. And it was literally the point of sitting down and saying, yes, I'm going to do this. And Bill died like a week later. And I said, if I can't talk to Bill, I can't tell this story. And so that sort of was a stillborn thing for me, and it never got any further. And yeah, it's my style of writing is I need to sit down and talk to these people. And yeah, the B70 really, I wish it did have a book sort of like this, but I just don't think there's enough people left that were part of that program that I could even talk to at this point. I do talk. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say I do tell some of the story of the B70 in the book because, of course, the connection with Joe Walker, because he was killed in that horrific crash,
Right.
and he had just left the X-15 program to become the chief NASA pilot on the B-70 when that accident occurred. He never actually got to fly the aircraft. He was slated for his first flight the following week. So that was one of the things that unfortunately helped kill the B-70 program as well. And so yeah, you will find a lot about the B-70 in there because a lot of the peripheral stuff, it was built by the same contractor. There were many people involved. The two pilots who were aboard the B-70 on that fateful June afternoon were Carl Cross and Al White. Al White was a contractor pilot for North American, and he also, again, has connection with the X-15 because Al White was Scott Crossfield's backup on the X-15 program. But Scott would not let him get anywhere near the airplane, so he never got to fly, which is why North American gave him project pilot status on the XB-70, so he had something to do. As Scott said, Al kept trying to break his legs or something because he really wanted to get on the X-15, but Scott was very good at dodging him, so it never happened. But again, so there's connections between the B-70 and the X-15 because of that.
What about something like the Burt Rutan Spaceship One? That story. I don't know if there's any books that have been written about that whole engineering.
There was actually a pretty good one that was put out. I forgot the author of it, but yeah, he did a pretty good job. I can't give you the title offhand. Should be able to be found like on Amazon or something.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is out there. Yeah, there's a lot of connection between Spaceship One and the X-15. There were several people from the X-15 that consulted with Rutan on that program. And in fact, one of my interviews I did was one of the guys had just come back from working at Scale Composites when we sat down one morning in his living room to do my interview. So again, there is connection to Spaceship One in there as well.
Sure.
So, I think we have our friend John who has found it. Oops, I think I hit it. I'm sorry. He has the title for you. Sorry about that. Just as I reached for it, it clicked over. Okay. Spaceship One, An Illustrated History by Dan Linehan. Yeah, Linehan. Yeah.
We have a signed copy from you.
Yes. Yeah, we worked with Dan on one. It was so long ago and stuff, and I couldn't think of his name. Thank you very much, John, for getting that. So
I'll look for that.
Yeah, definitely worth it. It's an excellent book. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Most welcome. Thank you for being here. Anyone else here or online? Have I bored everybody to tears now? Okay, well, with that, I guess we will shut down for the afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Again, for those of you here in person, please feel free to check out the display, and we'll have a bit of a break before we start part 2 of the program, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I do have a few copies of the books if anybody are interested in it today, and we'll go from there. So thank you all for being here today. Take care.